Yeah, Bismillah, alhamdulillah. Uh, when it comes to the Aqidah, certainly the Hanbalis have been known to be mostly or predominantly Atharis. There are a few things that I want to say here, because this is something that I have to train myself. I had to train myself all the time to do this. Sometimes partisanship can be an intellectual disability, because it prevents us from trying to understand, and basically we shut down and we just don't attempt to have a proper understanding. But the Hanbali school from the time of Imam Ahmad has been heavily Athari, because Imam Ahmad was all about Athar and was all about the dispraise of Kalam. It's it's also the generation, and it depends on what you mean by kalam, and whether like certain kalam would be accepted and not all kalam, and so on. But the idea that Imam Ahmad was against kalam and was all for athar is, I think, is an established idea. We can come later and talk about, what we mean by kalam, because I personally, and ironically, it is actually the Taymiyyan approach, the Taymiyyan school, which is basically more accepting of kalam and warmer to kalam among the Hanbalis. But Imam Ahmad himself, he's always like, ma sami'tu, I haven't heard this. فعلوه. Imam Ahmad, we didn't talk about Usul.
Yeah, I didn't talk about Usul, but if you want to, we can. If you want to go into Usul of his madhhab, if you feel that it's a priority to do that before Aqidah, we can do that.
Okay.
Let's do it. Since you brought it up, why don't we bring it? It was my chapter beforehand anyway, before Aqidah anyway. It has to be Usul, so let's do that. I wanted to ask about the Sunnah. Many times when I meet Shawafi', Shafi'iyya and Hanabila, they don't actually realize that the Hanafi and Maliki schools have sources they consider stronger than the single-chained Sahih Hadith. Okay. And they get a bit surprised sometimes when they do not accept that the single-chained Sahih Hadith to offer an exception to something that's come down in the Quran. And oftentimes the very concept of qat'i and dhanni is they're completely unaware of, right? Of course, anyone who grows up in a certain milieu is not going to be aware of certain, matters of usul. So that's forgivable in that respect. The idea here that if you could talk a little bit about that, and how is it that the Hanbali school recognizes the Sunnah? How do they define the Sunnah, I should say? That's really the question. How does the Hanbali school define, what is the order of matters within the Sunnah? We know, of course, the Malikiyya have the Amal, of course, right? And that's a big thing. We know the Ahnaf, they have this concept of the Qat'i and the Dhanni. So if you can expound on the Sunnah in the Hanbali school.
The Sunnah in the Hanbali school, it is certainly the scope of what is considered authoritative in terms of the Sunnah in the Hanbali school is wider. We do have the same recognition of Qat'i and Dhanni in terms of transmission. However, this is an usuli disagreement that is not necessarily defined along madhhab lines, whether, for instance, the muttafaq alayh, the hadith that are reported by both al-Bukhari and Muslim, are qat'i in transmission, definitive or speculative in transmission. And the Jumhur al-Usuliyin, or the majority of them, would consider them still to be dhanni in transmission, not definitive, speculative. But it is a controversial issue, and you will find people like Ibn Salah and Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Hajar and so on considering the agreed upon hadith as qat'i. When it comes to the Hanbali school, I was waiting to finish the qawl al-sahabi because I was going to come back to the sunnah after qawl al-sahabi. There is part of the sunnah in the Hanbali school, the sunnah that is authentic comes certainly before qawl al-sahabi, and Imam Ahmad would not leave the statement of the Prophet ﷺ for any statement. But according to Imam Ahmad, and that is where it becomes a little bit controversial. According to Imam Ahmad, he accepts the da'if hadith. He ranks the da'if hadith above al-qiyas. He does not, however, rank the da'if hadith above qawl al-sahabi or the positions that are reported from the sahaba. Yet, there could be some contention here. Which da'if hadith are we talking about? Different people posited different things. During the time of Imam Ahmad, the three-pronged classification had not come into the picture yet. This was introduced by at-Tirmidhi and the generation of Imam at-Tirmidhi. So during the time of Imam Ahmad, the sort of the concept of al-Hasan, they recognized that there is that certainly it is a scope, it is a spectrum, and the ahadith fall on that spectrum. And even within the one category of al-Hasan, you have al-Hasan al-Ghayru. And so people who say that Imam Ahmad accepted the da'if hadith that Abu Dawood would call Salih al-Ihtijaj, which is weaker than what Tirmidhi would call Hasan. So Salih al-Ihtijaj can basically considerable or can be used for corroboration or something of that nature. If the people who say that Imam Ahmad would accept those ahadith, they would certainly place them after qawl al-sahabi. The people who say that Imam Ahmad would accept what Tirmidhi would later call Hasan, or at least Hasan li-ghayri, and that's different people have different thoughts about this. And it seems that Imam Ahmad does accept all of them, including what Abu Dawood would call Salih al-Ihtijaj, which is even a little weaker than al-Hasan li-ghayri, but munjabir, meaning that it can be corroborated, it can be basically supported by other reports or by qawl al-sahabi or by something else to be acceptable in the ahkam. Imam Ahmad himself said that we verify the hadith when it comes to ahkam, and it was reported that he even pointed with his thumbs up like this, that the hadith and ahkam have to be, verifiable, but not in other areas. So there is that controversy. So Sunnah, according to Imam Ahmad, would include everything that came from the Prophet, including the not very weak hadith. But like I said, he would favor qawl al-sahabi over the da'if hadith, and certainly if it is Hasan or something, then he would favor it over qawl al-sahabi. So we said the Quran, and we said the Sunnah, we said the Ijma', and we talked about qawl al-sahabi, and he would accept the statement of the Sahabi, that is not basically contested by other Sahabis. But when it is contested, then he would choose. And sometimes when the sort of the disagreement is hard for him to settle, then he would report to all of them as valid positions. And then comes qiyas, and Imam Ahmad does accept qiyas, but he uses it for darura. When he does not find anything else, no other reports, nothing from the Prophet ﷺ, the Sahaba, the Tabi'een, then he would use qiyas. These are the ones that are clear-cut. We are very confident about them. Certainly, Imam Taymiyyah rahimahullah added to them, he posited that Imam Ahmad and many would agree with him in the madhhab, that Imam Ahmad also used the maslaha al-mursala, also used sadd al-dhara'a, also used istihsan. So maslaha mursala, consideration of public interest, and sadd al-dhara'a, blocking the means to evil. Just in case somebody listens to this and istihsan would be juristic preference, and istishab would be presumption of continuity, and even shar'a man qablana as well. The laws that were revealed or previous scriptures. So now. But that's contested, but certainly to a great extent, Imam Ahmad did use maslaha, did use istihsan, not the istihsan that the Imam Shafi'i condemned, but certainly different terms and different language games that they have different uses. So that would be, like, in a nutshell, the usul of Imam Ahmad.
Let's talk for a second and contrast the Hanbali fiqh and the Shafi'i fiqh, because a lot of times you hear comments and you notice that they're so similar. So in their furu', the results. So could you contrast for us some of the differences between Shafi'is, the Shafi'i usul and the Hanbali usul?
The two big ones is that Imam Shafi'i in his Jadid did not consider Qawl al-Sahabi to be a source. Although some of the Shafi'is would also disagree over this, but that seems to be a change between his Qadim and his Jadid. And another one is that Imam Shafi'i does not consider Sadd al-Dhara'a, whereas in the Hanbali madhhab we do consider Sadd al-Dhara'a. So those are two major differences, I believe. Imam Shafi'i does not necessarily state that al-da'if is acceptable. He does not prioritize al-da'if over al-qiyas. Imam Ahmad does. These are usuli differences. Certainly in furu' there could be like 10,000 differences between the Shafi'i and the Hanbali madhabs, but when it comes to usul, you do have some, to some degree, significant differences.
Can you give an example of where some of these differences manifest in the furu' between those two madhabs in particular?
Well, take for example, Sadd al-Dhara'a. Imam Ahmad would block the means like the bay' al-'anab liman yattakhidhuhu khamran, for instance, selling grapes to someone who would use them or make wine out of them. So the Malikis and Hanbalis, they have a much stronger consideration for Sadd al-Dhara'a. The Malikis and Hanbalis, they have a much stronger consideration for maqasid in ayman and maqasid in uqud, basically intents in oaths and intents in contracts. The Malikis and Hanbalis, for instance, would make istithna or exclusion by intent in oath. So if you make an oath and in your intent you exclude something from that oath, they would consider that exclusion a valid exclusion from the oath. So the intents in oaths and in contracts, certainly the Shafi'i madhhab in terms of contracts, they focus a lot more on the form of the contract than the Hanbalis or the Malikis for that matter.
In terms of contemporary issues, we notice that the fuqaha and the muftiin and the fatwa councils oftentimes have to dip into the usul, the methodologies, and the precedents set across the board. Right? Notice this. Is there a mas'ala that you can talk to us about that sort of requires a reliance on Hanbali usul or Hanbali principles that touches our daily lives?
Well, in al-mu'amalat, there are a lot of masail, basically, that they have used the Hanbali madhhab a lot in different majama and in different councils and different sharia boards in the area of mu'amalat, in the area of contracts, because the Hanbalis are very flexible with conditions. You know, المسلمون عند شروطهم إلا شرطا حرم حلالا أو أحل حراما. So Muslims, abide by their conditions or honor their conditions, except a condition that makes halal haram or haram halal. And the Hanbalis take this to heart, and they apply this in uqud, and they even apply this in marriage, like in prenuptial agreements, for instance. You can have a woman in the Hanbali madhhab stipulate that her husband would not have a second wife, or that she will not have a co-wife. And if he does not honor that condition, then Hanbalis, unlike other madhahib, would give her the right to divorce. They use this sometimes in certain laws in certain Muslim countries, but in uqud in particularly when it comes to Islamic finance, the Hanbali madhhab is used a lot to allow different conditions that would not otherwise be allowed in the other madhhab. But the Maliki madhhab has given Islamic finance basically, and it depends on whether you, like Sheikh al-Ghariani, for instance, in Libya, would not agree with the idea of al-wa'd al-munzim, which is the binding promise, particularly when it's mutually binding from both parties. But the Maliki madhhab, Islamic finance, would not survive without the binding promise, the concept of a binding promise, because in all the other madhahib, the promise is not binding. So, sale for the purchase orderer, which is bay' al-murabaha lil-amr bil-shira, sale for the purchase orderer, that would have not survived at all without binding promise. Even declining co-ownership, if there is no binding promise to buy, that would not survive. That sort of contract or model of Islamic financing would not survive. They have taken all of this from the Maliki madhhab, but anyway, the Hanbalis would allow for conditions unless the condition is clearly, is haram, is clearly haram. It's, positively forbidden in the Quran or Sunnah.
Okay, good. Do you have any other comments on the Usul point? I think that was a pretty brief chapter and doesn't really require much depth into it.
صلى الله على محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم